name is Patricia Infanti. I'm part of the Congregational Life staff team for the Central East Regional Group, and I'll be your guide over the next several sessions for a track called Guiding Our Journey, Building a Faithful UU Identity. Welcome to Module 2 of Guiding Our Journey. Our religious education programs often embrace the explicit goal of building UU identity in our children and youth, but the work of figuring out who I am and what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist is just as meaningful and necessary for adults. Unitarian Universalism requires you to be an active participant in building your religious identity, a task that sometimes requires letting go or unlearning painful lessons from our past. What does it mean to be a Unitarian Universalist? What role does faith development play in constructing a religious identity that matches your particular experience and your unique journey? This track will explore these important questions and lift up specific pathways and tools for identity exploration, suitable for congregational leaders. Module 2 is called Path of Many Names, and in this module, I'm going to take some time to introduce you to the topic of faith development from a Unitarian Universalist perspective. So sit back and welcome. I'm happy to be with you. Like I do in all of my work, it's important as religious leaders to take a moment to welcome ourselves to a sacred space, a place where we are inviting the Spirit to be with us, and we are hoping to be deepened and moved by what we do and what we experience. So I always like to take a moment to light a chalice, and I hope as a leader in the congregation that you have a similar practice, one of your own perhaps, but one that honors the work and our commitment to Unitarian Universalism. I'd like to share some opening words with you, and I invite you to think about this and think about how you are creating a life, the life you dream about. Each of us is an artist whose task is to shape life into some semblance of the pattern he dreams about. So let me start by saying faith development is a very big topic. I'm pleased that I will have a number of modules to spend with you so that we can delve more deeply into some of the topics, some of the concepts, some of the practices, and some of the tools that you have to develop and deepen your own faith development. But just know that all the answers will not be found in one module, or maybe even in 6 modules. And in some ways, it would be pleasing to me to know that you walked away with as many questions as you did answers. Understanding the questions in the path before us can be just as important as having the answers. So, what is Unitarian Universalist faith development? Well, in the words of my colleagues Connie Goodbread and the Reverend Susan Smith, who serve in the southern region, faith development is everything we do. Every piece of our congregational life, our worship, our service, our leadership, our covenant, our community building. Everything we do is a way of deepening our understanding of ourselves as Unitarian Universalists and the role of our faith in the world. They go on to say, all we teach is Unitarian Universalism. That is our ministry. We are Unitarian Universalists. We invite in the wisdom of many other faiths and many other thinkers and many other prophets. But our spin and our lens is uniquely Unitarian Universalist. The congregation is an important part of the faith development experience. The congregation is part of the curriculum. What we say and what we do and how we are with one another, those are all important parts of deepening our faith development. Another way of defining faith development, and this will take some time. This will take some thought on your part to come up with a faith development definition that feels comfortable and feels good for you. But this is another possible explanation. And this comes from the Tapestry of Faith curriculum, which is a curriculum available through Unitarian Universalist Association, UUA.org website. There are many, we're going to talk about Tapestry of Faith a little bit later in the program. And in fact, some of the handouts and some of the exercises that I will invite you to do will actually come from some of the adult programs that are available through the Tapestry of Faith. So, UU Faith Development emphasizes each person's religious journey, each person's lifelong process of bringing head, heart, and hands to seeking and knowing ultimate meaning. That's one that might take a little bit of time to think about. If we go back into our own history of Unitarian and Universalism in America, there are many luminaries and many prophets. And one of those is the great preacher, William Ellery Channing. He was a Unitarian, and he was one of the voices that really defined what Unitarianism was during his time. Many of his writings and many of his ideas persist today, and you will find them in Singing the Living Tradition, otherwise known as the Gray Hymnal. If you look up William Ellery Channing, you'll find several readings under his name. But one of the great quotes from his work is when he talks about the great end in religious instruction. And that quote is often used for religious education programs, perhaps an RE Sunday or an invocation for teachers. And in fact, he may not really have been talking about children when he made these remarks. And so they are just as applicable to the adult learning process, the adult faith journey. In a word, the great end in religious instruction is to awaken the soul to excite and cherish spiritual life. What a marvelous invitation. How can we be excited? How can we feel awake within ourselves and in our connection to the larger world? I invite you to meditate on that quote and think about how that resonates in your own life. And there is a discussion question for you to think about that. Faith development is part of our growth thinking. Some would call it a growth strategy, but it's really just we're always growing. The opposite of growth is death. And so all of our congregations are engaged in growth in some way, shape, or form. And we hope that that growth is healthy and vital. And some of the ways that we name that growth, and I think you've probably seen these before. Numerical, we grow in numbers. Maturational, we grow in our depth of spiritual roots, the breadth of our religious imagination. And we have a sense of a call. We have a sense that we have a message to take out to the larger world. The other kinds of growth are organic, which is around our internal processes and our governance and our leadership development, and incarnational growth, which is heading out into the world, taking our message, taking our energy, taking our Unitarian Universalist values out into the world beyond our congregation. So, faith development is really the maturational piece of growth. So, it's part of a larger picture of growth, and it's really it's an organizational piece of growth, but it really is manifest through the individuals in the congregation. So I want to share with you a structure, a framework for faith development that is often mentioned. You may hear about it in other contexts. James Fowler was a social scientist, a researcher, sometime in the middle of the 20th century, who did a lot of work around trying to identify how we grow in faith. James Fowler was a Methodist, I believe. He was from a mainline Protestant faith tradition. He was not a Unitarian Universalist, but these terms and this structure is widely considered to be something that we can at least begin with, and it's a place to hang our hat in the conversation about what is faith development. And the 7 stages start out when we're infants, when we're toddlers, when the world, we don't have the verbal expression. The world is really a place of sensuality. It's a place where we're experiencing most of our, having most of our experiences through our senses. And we move through a series of 7 stages. As children, we often intuit our religious or our faith story from the adults around us. We don't really have a sense of what spirit or God or some of the other larger concepts are, but we hear our family, we hear others around us talking about it. So we get this, we intuit from that this is something important. This is something that to pay attention to. It's part of the human experience, the common human experience. From that, we move as young as children into that questioning, that really taking everything literal, like how in the world did Jonah really get in that whale kind of questioning age. And we move forward through our teens, through our young adulthood, into group thinking or synthetic conventional thinking, where we really want to fit in. We really are want to have a framework that someone else provides for us, and we're a little afraid, or we're not yet developed enough in our spiritual maturity to step beyond the conventional thinking. And so many of the faith traditions that tend to be more dogmatic or even fundamentalist might appear in this band of the continuum. So there's really a very firm set of beliefs, and we don't really go much beyond that box as individuals. Then we move into a place where we're really beginning to individuate. We're really beginning to understand that perhaps dogmatic, uh, this dogma that we have been attached to for some period of our lives can be questioned. Now, that might not be welcomed by the authority, by the leaders in a particular faith tradition, but as individuals, we're having these thoughts within us where we're questioning the stories, we're questioning the dogma, we're questioning the unquestionables. And finally, we move to a place where we really have a deeper appreciation for all a variety of different faiths. So we move in the conjunctive phase to a belief that God or spirit or some construct of higher meaning is is common. It's a common part of the human experience, and my God is not better than yours. My understanding of what that God might be is different, but we all have this common connection to something larger. And so we have a deeper appreciation for that in that phase. And then that moves into the universalizing, where really your faith tradition is less important than just an overall sense of spirituality and connection to the universe and to greater and deeper meaning. And so the constructs of different faith traditions become more blurred and less important to our understanding. Now, many Unitarian Universalists sort of think of themselves back in that on that right hand set of the chart of the continuum. Um, that's less likely to be true. Many of us are still working in the middle, in the center, and it takes a deep sense of a deep spiritual maturity to really move beyond. But this is it's a theory, and it's a theory that's been called into question in a variety of different ways. But it's a starting place. So you shouldn't be measuring yourself. You shouldn't be trying to figure out where you are. You should just know that this is just language, and this is one way of thinking about the process of growing in faith. So another aspect of faith development, or another representation of faith development theory is rather than seeing it as um, as a continuum, because some folks see that continuum as being something chronological. And I start at the beginning, and as I reach different ages, I must be in a different place. And it's not really a chronological framework. It's as we grow from the inside out, so to speak. So some another way of representing the same idea is to say, well, we start with a small understanding of what our faith is and how we are connected to this larger meaning. And it grows in us, and it begins to expand outward into the world. So, same thinking, some slightly different labels, but another way to think about it. The other thing I invite you to think about with regard to James Fowler is that um, some of us, some of you, may have grown up in a different faith, in a different faith of origin than Unitarian Universalism. So you would have moved along that continuum as something else. And in fact, there's unlearning there's stepping back that has to take place. So sometimes we actually step back in our faith development journey. If we come into a new faith community or we begin a new spiritual practice. So it's not a completely linear journey. It's not a chronological journey. So spiritual growth is something that we're all experiencing in a variety of different ways. And I know that there are certain words that, and perhaps you're already feeling this sense of discomfort around the use of the word faith, the use of the word spiritual. I think I may have used the word God. Um, there are different names for these life experiences, how our life experience connects us to a sense um, of meaning. Why are we here? What is my place in the universe? So there are a variety of ways to name that. And if you have some challenge or some difficulty with some of these words, I encourage you to check the list of additional materials. I've posted a sermon there given a number of years ago by the former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Reverend William Sinkford. And it's called The Language of Reverence, in which he talks a little bit about how Unitarian Universalists need to be able to use some of these words in the public marketplace of religion, so to speak. That we need to reclaim those words. We attach different meaning to them than some folks in other faith traditions, but we can use these words with some facility and some level of comfort. And again, you as individuals, you're going to have a different reaction to different language. So I encourage you to just do some thinking about that. Think about what you might be reacting to. Spend some time, maybe even with a journal. How can I translate? When I hear this word, what does it mean for me? And how can I translate what I'm hearing into a term that is comfortable for me, that is something that I can accept? So where does this spiritual growth happen? Where are we experiencing these moments of transcendence that are going to lead us to our universalizing faith? Well, it happens when we're on our own. It happens in solitude. It happens in nature. It happens around the house when we're living and working alongside our close family members, our partners. It happens in intimate relationships. It happens in small groups. They can be a small group of friends, a long time, your college friends from 20 years ago. It can happen in an intentional small group, such as a small group ministry or covenant circle in a congregation. It can happen in a larger group. We can actually sometimes feel ourselves have that transformative thought or that transformative moment or a vision of how we could be different or how our lives could be different or how our faith can be different. We might have those moments in a large group, listening to a lecture, sitting in on a forum, even hearing music and appreciating art. It certainly happens in a congregational setting. It could happen in a committee meeting. It could happen as we're beginning to see ourselves as leaders, and we see ourselves differently than we saw ourselves perhaps before we moved into a leadership position or before we were invited into a leadership position. It can happen in the community. Many people have moments of transformation when they're out connecting with others, either interfaith conversations, interfaith prayer circles, service work in the community, neighborhood garden, working with children, Habitat for Humanity, whatever it is. We have those ways. They deepen our understanding of what it means to be a faithful person in our world. So there's a variety of different ways. And of course, in the congregation, for us, the primary way that we seem to experience spiritual growth is worship. Worship is still our primary community time as a congregational based faith. And it's a time where worship is a time where we may experience a variety of these things. We're in that large group, but we're also meditating or having interpersonal experience. We may be connecting, saying good morning, saying hello, shaking hands, passing the peace. So we're connecting with our fellow faithful Unitarian Universalists. So worship is a primary place for spiritual growth. So I just want you to think for a moment about faith development as a metaphor. And we're actually going to do some work on this later in the course, where I'm going to invite you to actually think about and create your own metaphor for faith development. For some people, it's an opening. For some people, it could be like a labyrinth. For some folks, it's a spiral. Some people think of their faith development journey as I'm on this road, this endless road, and it lays before me. Some people think of it as sailing, as being connected to our blue boat home. Some people find that their faith journey takes them out into nature. So faith development is as individual as we are in some respects. We have this structure from James Fowler, but we also bring into that our own personal experience. So my faith journey is not going to be the same as yours. For some, again, nature. Some folks think about the cosmos, think about their faith journey and visions of a really larger, broader concept of what it means to be a person of faith comes to mind. So we'll be talking again about your metaphor. For some people, it's really relationship. The deep relationship we have with others, the incidental relationships we have with neighbors, with strangers, the relationship that we have with nature. It's all about that touch and that heart-to-heart connection. So I want to talk a little bit about the ministry, the call of a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Our job is to grow spiritually mature Unitarian Universalists. And some of this idea actually comes from a document called the Cambridge Platform, which was a 17th century document. Excuse me. It talked about several different ways that we engage as Unitarian Universalists and as congregationally based folks, people of faith. And one of those ways was to have a preaching ministry. This is the way that we take our message out into the world. We have a message about, we have our 7 principles, we have a variety of different theological values and theological ideas and values that we want to take out into the world. And that's our public face, that's our preaching ministry. The teaching ministry is how we are equipped as individuals to do the work of the congregation, to do the work of Unitarian Universalists out in the world. And we're all part of that teaching ministry. The Cambridge platform also identifies leaders and elders in our congregations. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a later session, but just know that terminology. So interesting, just bringing us into the modern times. 90%, somewhere between, they say, between 85 and 90% of Unitarian Universalists come into this faith from another faith tradition or have been previously unchurched. So we don't have rules about this is the catechism, these are the things that you must learn to be a Unitarian Universalist. We're non-creedal. We give people freedom to explore and to take a faith journey that is unique to them. We don't have high expectations for how our members engage themselves in learning about Unitarian Universalism and building a Unitarian Universalist identity. As a result, sometimes we are looking around our congregation and we're wondering, who are the teaching elders? Who are the folks who are carrying the faith forward to future generations? Well, that demographic of having many folks coming in from other faiths or other churched or unchurched traditions has been tricky for us. Our adult membership has been going down incrementally. Our RE enrollment has begun to trend down. That's always been a strong place of growth for us. So not having this, being non-creedal and not having high expectations around how our adults educate themselves and take on the UU identity pieces may not be serving us as a faith. So a large part of what our congregations are doing is equipping people to grow into spiritually mature Unitarian Universalists. UU identity is a piece of a larger picture of service and generosity and life skill and leadership. The things that separate us from the UCC or the Methodists or the Episcopalians, there are several things. The main thing is our theology. This is part of what defines our UU identity. We have a theology that is unique to Unitarian Universalism. We have a history and a heritage. We have prophets and we have folks who have moved our faith forward for centuries, folks whose voices and whose words have continued to stay with us into the modern time and to be reinterpreted and reasserted. We're covenantal. Not all faiths are covenantal in nature. We are accountable to one another within Unitarian Universalism. We strive to be inclusive. We have no creedal requirements. We don't have a dogma that one must accept. We invite people to come into our midst who are still seeking and who are still really uncertain where their faith journey is taking them. And we're justice seeking. We believe that an important part of our faithfulness is bending the arc towards justice. All of these things together can be seen as parts of how we create and how we step into and how we own a Unitarian Universalist identity. I want to just touch on spiritual maturity for a couple of minutes here. Spiritual maturity, and we're going to spend some time talking about some very specific aspects of spiritual maturity in a future session. So I'm really just introducing some ideas here for you. But one of the important things to know about spiritual maturity is that it goes hand in hand with emotional maturity. So we think of emotional maturity. If you've done healthy congregations training, you may recognize that term. We think of it as just being able of being a functioning self. That our emotional maturity is about how we function in the presence of others. And again, you will hear some of this in the Smart Church module, and we will hear some of this in a future module in this track. But so there's an idea that we're differentiated from others, and really emotional maturity and spiritual maturity, they go hand in hand, but emotional maturity is a step ahead. We really need to have certain pieces of ourselves reach a point of emotional maturity before the spiritual maturity can begin to take hold within us. Peter Steinke says that the presence of mature, self-aware, and faithful leaders means that health is possible in a faith community. So and again, if you're doing the Smart Church module, which I think you should be, and we'll talk about this again at a later time, but just this idea that healthy, vital religious community requires leaders who are emotionally mature, self-aware, or self-differentiated, and those things contribute to our growing sense of spiritual maturity. Some of the markers of spiritual maturity that we're going to address in a coming session. I'm just going to go through them quickly here. A growth in our ability to stand with others in pain, stand with others in times of struggle, stand with others in their brokenness. Growth in self-differentiation, that I know where I end and I know where you begin. And this helps us to be in a healthy relationship. We can be covenantal with one another. We grow in compassion. Our hearts grow. We feel that sense of commitment to the world. We understand that we are one among many, and that there are others who are suffering. There are others who are in need. And we open our hearts to that. And sometimes that means making ourselves vulnerable. We're going to talk about vulnerability in a future session. So I encourage you to look at the TED Talk that's posted in your materials in your materials section, a TED Talk by Brené Brown, and she will talk about vulnerability. We grow in generosity. Generosity not only in terms of our financial commitment, but also generosity of spirit, how we care for others, how we care for the earth, how we care for this faith, how we become stewards of the faith. We grow in our resilience. We're all faced with struggle in every moment, every day. And some different people have different ways of dealing with that struggle and dealing with the pressures of the world outside of us and our own psyche. And part of spiritual maturity is just having better tools and building a greater resilience to the undifferentiated behavior of others around us. We grow in our sense of the universal. We have this sense that we are part of something larger. When we are very, very young, We are the universe when we're infants, when we're toddlers. And as we go through life, we in some ways become smaller as our vision of the world and the universe becomes larger. Growing spiritually mature Unitarian Universalist leaders is possible, and it is an important part of what we need to do and what we should be doing in our congregations. And many congregations are doing this very well. Um, Part of it revolves around having intentionality about that, and we're going to talk about ways in which congregations have created intentional pathways for helping their people become spiritually mature. We provide direction and opportunity. We provide opportunities for spiritual maturation through worship, through connection with the arts, through opportunities for individual spiritual practice. Through opportunities for service, things like that. We are, as congregational communities, we are equipping people. We're helping them to get the skills that they need. Remember, congregations are learning communities. This is what we come to our congregations for. We're all learners there. We come to hear a sermon, so our brains, our minds are fed intellectually. We come together to share in service work. We serve the congregation by providing hospitality on Sunday, so our hands are at work, and we are growing in our relationship and our willingness to be in relationship with others in community. So we're all learners and we're all teachers. The congregation is the curriculum. I have something to learn from you. You have something to learn from me. And spiritual growth isn't about knowing things. There's not a checklist. There's not a book of knowledge that says, once I finish this book, I'm spiritually mature. It's a feeling, it's a growing, it's a knowing, but not just knowing. And remember, our learning community is a full one. There's a sense of wholeness in our congregations because it's not monocultural. We have children, we have youth, we have different kinds of adults, different aged adults. Sometimes we're all together in a multi-generational setting, and we learn differently, and we learn different things. The stories are changed when we're in different age settings. Spiritual growth, again, it happens in a variety of different ways. It happens through our personal experience, which is very primary to the Unitarian Universalist faith development journey. But it also happens in small groups. It happens in those communal settings, worship. It should happen in age segregated settings. So age appropriate learning is also important to our spiritual growth. And we're very intentional about doing that with our children. We have kindergarten, we have sixth grade, we have youth group, but we're not always as intentional about creating those segregated settings, age segregated settings for our adults. Things like retiree groups or women's groups or different kinds of niche gatherings. So we're going to talk about this again in a later session. So again, just introducing a term, introducing an idea to you. The idea of how we learn and how we begin to get a sense of UU identity. It begins with story. It begins with my story, your story, a wisdom story, a story from the community. And from that story, we meditate. Through spiritual practice, through discernment, through conversation, we derive meaning from that story. What does that story mean for me? How does it connect with my values, with the Unitarian Universalist story. And then I might take some action that that kind of helps me to see those values in action and to understand more deeply what they mean, followed by reflection. So this cycle of learning is something that often happens in our congregations, unintentionally, or if you're doing a curriculum, say from Tapestry of Faith for adults, it's going to happen very intentionally. We're going to talk about this again at a later session in some more detail, but there are different ways that different models that we typically see in our congregations. And small group ministry, many of you may be familiar with that. There's typical traditional curriculum-based programs, adult spiritual practice. You may have a journaling group. You may have a Tai Chi group. You may have a labyrinth on your site. There are discussion groups. There's thematic programming. And sometimes that we even engage in retreats, either personal or small group or congregation-wide family retreats. This is another way of thinking about our journey as we move from a seeker in a congregation to a member, to possibly a leader, and then to an elder. And we're going to spend some time on this next time. So this is just to introduce you to these different pieces of the faith journey. There's a journey of transformation coming into Unitarian Universalism or growing into Unitarian Universalism. There's a journey of identity where we really begin to understand what our unique Unitarian Universalist identity is and how that inhabits and our lives and guides our thinking. There's a journey of leadership. Many people, when they've been members for some period of time, feel called into leadership. And then finally, we have been around for a while. We have perhaps been leaders, hopefully been leaders. We have a sense of commitment to passing on the faith, and that's part of the journey to elderhood. And we'll spend some time on that. We're going to create a pathway, and this is small. Don't try to read it. We're going to be looking at this in much more detail. But there are ways of thinking about our faith journey that can be a little bit more structured and intentional. And so when we say intentional, we may think about, so in different life stages along the left, what are the kinds of things that I need or want or am called to learn about, experience, discuss, or otherwise sort of add to my faith journey backpack. So we'll talk about this chart in a coming session. Another important part of our faith journey, and sometimes there's resistance to this, but the idea of being together in multi-generational, multicultural community is really important to our development of a UU identity. Multi-generational communities there's a sense of wholeness in being together. There are the gifts that others bring that I do not have, and maybe I'm not even aware of. But they are important gifts, and they help me to enlarge my vision of the world and to grow my spiritual maturity. Multi-generational provides us with a sense of belonging, and it offers that sense of wholeness in a community, in a society that's really based on separateness. We have our children are separated in their early lives into different grades. Our adults are separated in a variety of ways. We have retirement communities for our elders now. They're separated from the community and the neighborhoods of the past. Folks who are in the prime of their working lives are separated from their families during the day. And so there's a lot of separation and division that happens. And of course, we have cultural and racial separations that are very abundantly evident in our world and contribute to that sense of brokenness that we have when we're thinking and talking and seeking beloved community. Worship is one of the most important ways that we can come together multi-generationally, and it's a place for relationship building as well as a place for learning. And in some congregations, we do religious education for everybody on Sunday morning. Wayne Arneson and Kathleen Rowlands, who are our senior ministers, co-ministers at West Shore in Cleveland, wrote a wonderful book called Worship That Works. And one of the wise pearls that has come from that book is that everything that makes your service more accessible to children makes the service more accessible to adults. So this idea of deepening our own individual spiritual maturity by being in a setting that is accessible and inclusive and multicultural and multi-generational, that's part of how we grow. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. That's our session for today. I appreciate the time that you've given. I hope that you have many questions. Feel free to post those questions to the forum. I'd love to get some discussion going around them, and also find out what kinds of questions you would like to work through together in a future session. So go your ways, knowing not the answer to all things, yet seeking always the answer to one more thing than you know.